Welcome CSC 103 to our extra credit assignment called 17 EC, and this is using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, mainly HTML and JavaScript, just a little bit of CSS. The only CSS we're using on this, if you take a look at this page here, is just this light blue background and a margin. So that's the only CSS we're using. You can certainly add more. You could color the H1 and do different things, make the button bigger and color it and all that kind of stuff. But that's all we're doing right now, because what we really want to have happen is you click on this, and here's the instructions. Click the button to show a random SpongeBob character. I'm getting very excited. You're going to display image, and there's Sandy Cheeks. It shows the picture, it shows the name. This is actually an image that's inside of a div area. And this is just an H2 down here, sub headline. And this name is going to show up. And every time we click this, it's going to do a random name and a random picture, but they're going to be matched up. So we're going to do that. And here's Eugene Krabs. There's SpongeBob. There's Patrick Star. There's Sandy. There's SpongeBob, and so on. And we're first going to do the image and the name, and then we're even going to put in a random color, but they're all going to be in the same order so that when the random number comes up, it'll make sure it'll pick out Sandy, it'll pick out the name Sandy Cheeks, and it'll pick out the color that kind of references her. Now, I went with a darker color because it's kind of hard to get the lighter color to look good down there in text. But we could always change that. You could always change the font. But that's all that's going to happen here is just clicking on this. And if you look at the code, I'll make this a little bit smaller here so you can see the code. It looks like a lot of code, but really this is the JavaScript code. We have a bunch of variables. We have 6 variables for each character. And what we did is we put in the URL of the image so that the URL is not going to be in the page. It's going to get written to the page each time the button is clicked. So we're going to store the URLs and the whole image source. This is the whole HTML tag is being stored here, and it's going to be inserted into our index page. Because if I go to my index page, there's nothing here. There's no image, but we're going to put that in there when we click the button. So that's going to make what's called dynamic HTML. It'll put HTML when the page loads and we hit the button. So it'll rewrite the HTML as the page is loading. So that makes it dynamic because this page will be changing. Also, the name will change. There's nothing in here for H2, and it's going to put in SpongeBob SquarePants or Eugene Krabs or whatever. So it's going to put in a name, and then it's also going to style too. That's the last thing that we put in, is just we're going to style it with a color. So most of our work is just kind of setting up our variables, and then we're making lists of those variables because it's just easier than putting in a whole URL each time. So we're just going to store all these URLs as variables. Then we're going to have a list of those URLs. And then we're going to basically pull out a random one out of these. So out of 0 through 5, and I'm saying 0 through 5 because we count from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those are the index positions in a list, just like in Python. This will be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when the random number 0 comes up, it'll take SpongeBob, it'll take SpongeBob SquarePants, his name, and it'll take gold, the color. So it'll do all these orders here from 0 through 5. That's why we're making the 3 lists here of the URLs, which is we are calling images, the full names, which we're going to put underneath, and then also the color, which is going to color the names. And then basically we have just a little function here. It's not a whole lot. 3 lines are just generating a random number, which in Python, you could do that in 1 line, but in JavaScript, it takes 3 lines to generate the random number from 0 through 5. And then these are just going to target the pick ID, and it's going to throw in the image from this list, which if it gets a 1, it's going to put Patrick in there. And then it's going to write some HTML again, and from the full names 1, it'll take Patrick Star. And then from this one, from name, it'll style it with number 1, which would be Coral. And we'll use Coral with Patrick. So if it was Patrick, the number 1 was the random number that came up. It would put the Patrick image, the Patrick Star name, and then it would use the Coral color. And the way it's all going to take place, here's our function call down here that's going to target button, and it's going to put an add event listener method, and it's going to use the click event, and it's going to run the show image function, which is this function. So then when we do this and we refresh the page, there's nothing there. Because remember, the pick ID is empty and the H2 ID of name is empty. But now when the function gets run, when we click this, it shows a random character. So that's what's going to happen. So let's get started from scratch. It won't take us that long. and we're going to do this in Replit. This is the first time we're doing this in Replit. I used to do it in CodePen, so there's just a couple little extra things we have to do to make sure we're linked up properly. So we're going to start this from scratch. I'm going to go to my Replit account, and I'll go to my repels, and I'll go into this folder for this particular semester, and I'll make a new repel, HTML, CSS, JS. I'll call it 17EC for extra credit, and it'll be SB Random SB for SpongeBob, and you could put JS or whatever. I'll just put my last name, first initial, or you could just put your initials, whatever your initials are, that's fine. And again, I like you to do that in case I have to bring it into my account. That way it looks different than anything else that I have. So I'll create my repel. And again, when you make a new repel, it does give you a fresh index, JS, and CSS page. And that's good because we're going to be using a linked style.css file, which is there, and a linked JavaScript file, which is there. So that's all set up for us. And the only thing we'll do in here is change the title, and we'll just put Random SpongeBob, something like that. Hello World you can get rid of, and I'll actually replace it and put JavaScript link, and then I'll highlight it and use Command if I'm on a Mac, Control if I'm on Windows, and question mark. And it'll make an HTML comment, and I'll put a bunch of dashes here, and I'm just using it as like a separator because it's inside my body. So I'm just going to move it down here. It's the last thing in my body tag. So all my HTML is going to go in here, and the link to the JavaScript's last because they recommend that it loads last on the page. And we are going to use this, so before you collapse this completely, we are going to use the console just to go over the random number thing when we do the JavaScript part. So to get started with this, I do have an old handout. I'm going to have to update this because this is the one from using CodePen, but a lot of it's going to be the same. And I'm even going to copy this part here because it should work, and I'll just tell you what it does as we go through it. But we're going to go in here, and I'm just going to paste this, but I just want to show you what's going on here. There's an H1, and inside curly braces, it's going to say Random SpongeBob image. So that's the text that's going to display in an H1. And then when things are on the same level, we just put a plus. So then there's going to be a paragraph, and we could type the paragraph in there. We don't have to put the copy that's in there. And then we're going to have a button, and then right after button, we could put button ID, and we'll call it BTN. That'll be the ID name for the button. And then we'll also have a div, and you can see it has an ID name of pic, P-I-C, and then we'll also have an H2, and it has an ID name of name. So we have name ID, pic ID, and button ID, 3 ID names, which we're going to use for JavaScript because we're going to contact all 3 of those. The button is going to contact these 2 things to make something happen. And that should be the image on the page. Now, even if you copy that from the notes, sometimes if you just hit tab here, it won't work. Watch this. And it didn't work. So sometimes you might have to backspace and put the E here and then hit tab, and now it works. And again, we're going to have an H1 that says Random SpongeBob image, paragraph which is empty, which we could click the button. We could just put our instructions here. Click the button to show a Random SpongeBob image, and I should say character, and I'll move this over a little bit, make sure I have that spelled right. And that's what's in the paragraph. And then we have a button ID. Now we could put a label on the button. We'll just say display image. That's it. And there'll be nothing inside the div for now, and there'll be nothing in the H2 for now. But what I'll do is I'll show you what we are going to put in there, and then we're going to make JavaScript do that. So far, if we take a look at this, and I'll bring this over, and I'll open it in a new tab, this is all we have, 3 things. So we're going to change that first. So we'll change our CSS first. So I'm going to move this over, not all the way, but I'll move it over. I'll go into my CSS, and I'll just put a declaration for body, and we'll just put like 2 things. We'll just make our margin 36 pixels all around, and we'll make a background color, and I'll just use sky blue, and I'll choose that for now. And I think that's all I should need. If you want to make the font size bigger, you could. You could put font size. I didn't do that the first time, but you could put like 110 or something just to make things a little bit bigger. And that's all you should need for body. So now when you refresh it, now you have that background color, now you have that blue, and now you have things a little bit bigger. The button could even be a little bit bigger, so we could make that bigger later. But that's all we need now. Now we still have an empty div here where we're going to put an image, and we're going to put a H2 down here, which is also empty. So let's do that now. And you might say, well, why do that now if we're going to do that with JavaScript? Well, just to make sure that everything's working. Now, if you remember, if we're going to put in a image, we use an image IRC. So I could go in here and do img tab, and then it's looking for an alt, which is just the alternate text in case the image wouldn't load. So I'll just put pic. Now, that doesn't mean anything for us, but our URL is going to have to go in there of where this image is, and the image is online, just like the Patrick one, it's online. So I have this all in the notes. So I'm just going to start off with SpongeBob, and I'm just going to copy this right off the notes. And you could copy it right off the notes too, or you could just remember that it's the same one like we used last time. And notice after the main kind of URL, it's just going to be SpongeBob ping, Patrick ping, Squidward ping, Sandy ping, Krabs ping, and Larry ping. And I'm going to copy this right from here, and it has to go in quotes. So when we go back here, it's going to go in as the source. Now, it put in a number 1 because it copied it from the page, and I'll just get rid of that. So make sure you get rid of that in case that comes in there. So that's what it looks like right now. And what I'm going to do, before we do anything, I'm going to put a single quote. And I'm going to go here and put a single quote, because we're going to change that later, so I'm just going to do it now. And I'll put a single quote. You could have single quotes, not a problem, but we're going to put everything, this whole tag, in a quote eventually, so that's why I'm doing that now. And this isn't going to stay here. We're going to take this out. So we're putting an image on a page, and then if we want to put a name in here, I could just put SpongeBob SquarePants. So that just is going to make sure that this page works. And we're not doing any JavaScript yet. So I'm going to go back up here, I'm going to refresh the page. And there's SpongeBob SquarePants, and there's the text. So now we have the image, and we have the H2. Now, it's not in a color that we want, but this thing doesn't work. We're not doing anything here. It's just loading the page. It's a static page. But what we want to have happen is have nothing here, and when we hit the button, it's going to display an image, and it's going to be random. And I'll show you how to do it random with JavaScript. But that's what's going to happen, but we just want to make sure this works. Now, as long as we have this stuff in here, as long as we have this whole tag, I'm going to highlight this whole tag in here, and I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to go to my JavaScript, and I'm going to make a variable. And you could look at your notes to see how that's done, how the variables are done. This is how it's done, and we're going to do it just like this. And notice we're going to have quotes on the outside and single quotes inside. So that's why I mentioned that. Now, this one doesn't show the alt tag, but we can keep the alt tag in there. So I'm going to put var, and I'm just going to put SpongeBob. Now, this is a variable name. So the variable SpongeBob, the name is going to be equivalent to, and I'm going to paste that. Now I'm also going to highlight the whole thing and put quotes around it. Now you could highlight the whole thing and then just hit your shift quotes, and it'll put quotes around it. Now when you have multiple quotes, you want to make sure that you alternate them. So I have double quotes on the outside and single quotes on the inside. Now we could have done the opposite, but I always like the double quotes on the outside and single quotes on the inside, on the inner element. So however you want to do that, but that's the way I wanted to do it, so that's why I changed it. Now I'm going to spread this out. I could even close this up so everything's on one line. And what we're going to do is we're going to have 6 variables that are basically going to be all these characters. And I'll do all this, and then we could take a break and work more on the JavaScript. But this will get everything set up. So I'm going to put a semicolon after every statement, and then I'm going to copy this, and I'm just going to paste it so we have 6 altogether. Now they're not all going to say SpongeBob. This is going to say Patrick. Now our variable names I'm keeping lowercase, just so you know. They just represent, these variable names represent the long URL. And then Squidward. The order matters, so I'll do it in terms of who's most popular on the show or who has most screen time, I guess. So Squidward, and then Sandy, and then Krabs, and then Larry. Although, you know, that could be debated of who else is on there more. I'll make sure I have my 2 R's in here. But that's what we have in here right now. And we have to make sure that these things change too. So I'm going to just highlight this, copy it, and paste Patrick here so we have the right image. So I'll do that. Copy, paste, paste. Okay, and the alt pics can all stay the same. They could be the same, but all the images are correct. SpongeBob, Patrick, Squidward, Sandy, Krabs, Larry, and the variable names, and everything else is the same. So that should be good. So these are all the variables that we need. And again, these variable names are representing these long URLs. Because there's so much stuff here and we don't want to have to keep pasting it, we're going to use these. So these are like shortcuts, nicknames for this stuff here. And then we're going to put these variables in a list. So right away, we can even make a list. We're going to say var, and we're going to call it images, because that's what these really are. These are the images. We're going to put var images equal, and in a list, we're going to use square brackets. So we're going to use square brackets just like Python. And I'll just copy this. Copy that, paste it, comma. Copy this, paste it, comma, copy, paste, comma, copy, paste, comma, and no comma after Larry. So these are the variables in a list. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6 of them, but keep in mind their index positions are going to start with 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's very important because we're going to use a random number from 0 through 5, and it's going to be, this is going to be 0, this is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's how we're going to come up with a random character from this list here. So this is a list of variables that represent these. So whenever this comes up, it's going to use that URL to show the image on the page, and it's going to plug this information, this tag, this HTML tag, which is kind of in quotes just like text. It's going to plug it into my page. So it's going to put it in here where there's nothing. It's going to put it here. Now you're going to say, well, there's something there. Well, I'm going to get rid of it because we don't want anything there, and I don't want this here because it's going to be empty to start. So that's going to be empty to start, and it's going to look like this when we start it, and then when we run our function with our event listener, the button is going to make a random character appear and a random name appear, and they should be matched up because they'll use the same number. So that's what we're going to do in part 2. So we have our HTML set up almost completely, and we have our style set up. You can do more if you want with any headlines or anything like that. And our JavaScript, we have most of our variables set up. We're actually going to make another list of the names, the full names, and I'll do that in part 2. So we have one more list that we're going to do, and I'll kind of move this so you can see what it looks like. It looks a little cleaner this way. And we're going to make a list of the full names so the full names could display underneath. And then eventually we'll even make a list of colors, but we'll make sure it works first before we worry about colors. And then we're just going to have one function and one function call that's going to display it on the page, just like we did with the Show Patrick exercise. And we're even going to test out in our console over here, we're going to test out the random number just so you can see how it works, so you don't just take my word for it of the way it generates a random number. So we're going to do that in part 2. So I'm going to stop here, and in part 2 we're going to finish up with our JavaScript for our 17 extra credit SpongeBob random using JavaScript.